The U.S. Senate returns to session today to resume work on a bill authorizing dozens of various federal water, coastal, and environmental projects. A vote to cut off debate on the measure is set for noon. It's possible, however, that the vote may not be needed if senators can agree to a plan to get to a final vote on the measure. Also possible, debate and votes on two of President Obama's picks to head the Energy Department and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Live coverage now here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
I think you're going to have to.
I'm going to have to move.
No problem.
Here we go.
Let us pray. Lord God Almighty, we sing praises to you, for you bless all those who depend on you for strength. You are the shield that protects our nation. You treat us with kindness and honor. Lord, pour your Spirit upon our senators so that they will feel your transforming presence. May they use the abilities you have given them to make the world a better place. Help them to take seriously their opportunity to be instruments of your grace. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 14, 2013. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Elizabeth Warren, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President, Madam President.
Mr. Leader.
The Republican leader and I just spent a minute commiserating on the fact that we follow, both of us, very closely, the Washington Nationals. And we talk often about how they fare on a given day. And we talk about the Las Vegas young man, Bryce Harper, often, because he's really a phenomenon in baseball. And yesterday they're playing in Los Angeles, a late game, 2 walks, a hit, and like he does all the time, or not like this, he's chasing a ball at full speed and runs into the wall full speed. I'm told the Republican leader is going to talk to his family when the time is too early in the West. I'll talk to his mom or dad and find out how he's doing. But he crashed into that wall. He has 11 stitches in his chin. He was knocked out. He hurt one of his shoulders, so we'll see how he is. So,
Friend, the majority leader.
Of course.
Yeah, as the majority leader indicated, we were talking about this before we went into session. This kid is the most incredible competitor I've ever seen. The game is on the West Coast, and I don't know whether my friend stayed up that late or not, but I didn't stay up late enough to get the crash into the wall. When you speak to his mother, remind her this is one thing that the leaders on both sides fully agree on. We're hoping Harper has a speedy recovery and back in the lineup.
And the manager said, when asked afterwards about him, he said, I don't want him to change anything because he's such a competitor. And I think you maybe have to watch those balls a little in the future. hope he's...
You're both wearing the same suit today.
Yes, we try. The senator from California said we're wearing the same suits. We try to match wardrobes. Madam President, following leader remarks, the Senate being a pre morning business until 11 this morning. The majority will control the first half, Republicans the final half. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of S-601, the Water Resource Development Act. And I would ask consent that the full time 1 hour be given to the Democrats half hour, Republicans a half hour. And if the vote has to come a little bit later, we just need to get out of the way before our caucuses. And we could probably terminate that at noon. I think that'll be fine. So I ask consent that the Democrats have their full half hour and Republicans their full half hour.
Without objection.
Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the Water Resource Development Act. And as I indicated to a meeting I had just a few minutes ago, this is really an important bill. And it shows that one of our most liberal members of the Senate can work with one of the most conservative members of the Senate, Boxer and Vitter. They worked extremely well. They're exemplary work on this bill. And I hope that we can have a finite list of amendments and not have to invoke cloture. Because we would invoke cloture, and I would rather not do that. The filing deadline for all second-degree amendments to the bill is 11:15 today. Matters to continue to work on agreement to complete action on the bill. If no agreement is reached, then there will be a cloture vote at noon today. Madam President, on Thursday, Speaker Boehner said a remarkable thing. He said, and I quote, "We can't cut our way to prosperity." It was good to hear him speaking candidly. That's what Democrats have been saying for years. We cannot cut our way to prosperity. It's important we've done some cutting, and that's extremely important, and we're proud of the work we've done. To this point, more than $2.5 trillion we've cut. It will take more than a Meat Act's budget cut, though, to keep our economy on the path to full recovery. To protect economic growth, it will take a balanced approach, one that couples smart spending cuts with investments in our future and some new revenue from closing these wasteful loopholes that I've spoken to members of the Finance Committee and my caucus about on many occasions. So nothing could be further from that balanced policy than the so-called sequester. As long as sequester's harmful across-the-board cuts remain in effect, our economy is in jeopardy. And as long as Republicans refuse to go to conference on the budget and work out our differences, the sequester will remain in effect. It's now been, Madam President, 52 days since the Senate passed its budget. Why are Republicans standing in the way? We've talked about that for weeks now. We need to move forward and pass a budget that encourages economic expansion by investing in what makes America strong while cutting the deficit. After years of calling for regular order, after years of demanding the Senate pass a budget, I expect the Republicans to embrace this process. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Republicans have objected to a conference a half a dozen times and counting. It's obvious they're delaying for one nakedly partisan reason. They hope to delay compromise long enough to create another manufactured crisis as the nation once again approaches the debt. The debt ceiling, Madam President, is something that we used to just move past. And the elephant never forgets. But Republicans obviously don't follow their mascot, an elephant, as they have a very short memory. Elephants don't, but the Republican Party does. They should remember the political pain they inflicted upon them, the Republicans, and our country over the last 2 years, in part by driving the country from one manufactured crisis to the next. It's astonishing that Republicans will once again, as they passed in the House last week, a bill to hold the full faith and credit of the United States government hostage, if only because it's so bad for their political brand. But it's also bad for our country. The last time Republicans drove us to the brink of default, it cost the United States its pristine credit rating. It cost the economy billions of dollars. When I talk about Republicans, Madam President, I'm not speaking about Republicans generically, that is, Republicans around the country, because many Republicans, if not most Republicans, agree that these manufactured crises are a waste of time and not good for our country. I'm talking and directing my attention to the Republicans in the Congress, because they don't obviously agree with Republicans around the country. I hope my Republican colleagues will not take their partisan ploy as far as they have in the future, in the past. It's time to embrace regular order. It's time to get away from last-minute negotiations and short-term fixes. It's time to engage in a responsible budget process. The budget process is the only way to work through our differences without bringing the country to a verge of another artificial crisis. Americans are really tired of bitter battles over whether the federal government should have paid the bill that they've incurred. That's what we've done, Madam President. We've incurred these bills. We have to pay them. We've made purchases on credit. Americans know, as Democrats do, that Congress won't set sound fiscal policy during last-minute negotiations. Congress won't set sound fiscal policy through extortion or hostage-taking. Now, the Secretary of Defense is going to announce later today that 800,000 civilian employees at the Defense Department are going to get furloughs. The decision is yet how long it's going to be. He hopes he can make it 11 days, but probably it'll be 2 weeks. Now, that may not sound like much, but for somebody who's on a budget, personal budget, depending on their wages, to suddenly say during the time until September 1st you're going to be furloughed, that is, you're not going to get paid for 14 days, that's a significant amount of wreaking havoc with their personal budget. What this sequestration is doing is setting bad fiscal policy. It can't happen. We have to compromise. It won't set sound fiscal policy without us sitting down at the negotiating table to find common ground between Republican priorities here in this Congress and Democratic priorities here in this Congress. Passing a budget would clarify each side's values, and it did that. We had a vote-a-thon here determining what Republicans thought was the right thing to do. We finished at 5 o'clock in the morning, and what Democrats should do. We thought that was a good step toward compromise, but we were wrong. Republicans will not move forward. We've waited 52 days. The next step is to name conferees, and that will only be a first step. After the conferees are named, we have to make sure that they meet and work things out. Right now, Republicans are the only thing standing in the way of progress, getting rid of this sequestration. If my Republican colleagues are serious about reducing the deficit and charting a course for economic growth, they should stop waiting around for another crisis-induced deadline and start working with Democrats today. Finally, again, it's been 52 days since a Republican passed. I'm sorry, let's start over, because I can read. It's been 52 days since the Senate passed this bill. We're waiting for Republicans to follow regular order and move to a conference.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
Over the past few days, we've heard many in the media talk about how this has been a rough week for the administration. That's because it's been a worse week for the First Amendment. On Friday, we learned that, just as we'd been told by our constituents, the IRS deliberately targeted conservative groups across the country in the midst of a heated national election. Over the weekend, we learned that the extent of it was even broader than we originally thought. Then this morning, we all learned that the targeting wasn't limited to an IRS office out of Cincinnati, as the administration suggested last week, but that it reached all the way to the IRS headquarters right here in Washington. What we don't know at this point is whether it jumped the fence from the IRS to the White House. But we do know this. We can't count on the administration to be forthcoming about the details of this scandal, because so far they've been anything but. So this morning I'm calling on the President to make available completely and without restriction everyone who can answer the questions we have as to what's been going on at the IRS, who knew about it, and how high it went. No stonewalling, no more incomplete answers, no more misleading responses, no holding back witnesses, no matter how senior their current or former positions. We need full transparency, and we need full cooperation. The American people deserve answers. The answers that the IRS has now owned up to and that were uncovered by their own Inspector General are an outrage, an absolute outrage. We now know that the IRS targeted groups for using such terminology as, get this, we the people, and for educating folks about the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. What's also clear is that government officials repeatedly failed to own up to what they knew was going on, when it turns out they'd known about it since at least the middle of 2011. So the IRS knew what was happening, yet they continued to give us assurances that they were applying the tax rules in a fair and impartial way. Despite repeated assurances from the Obama administration that it was not targeting its political enemies through the IRS during the last election cycle, we've now learned that the IRS was, in fact, singling out conservative groups who dared to speak up and express their First Amendment rights. So let's recap what happened. Last March, after receiving multiple claims of unusual harassment by the IRS from constituents who wanted to form tax-exempt political organizations, I and several of my colleagues sent a letter to then IRS Commissioner Schulman questioning selective enforcement of tax-exempt organizations. Now we learn, according to the IRS own Inspector General, that the IRS was well aware that this selective treatment was happening at the time our letter was sent, and in fact had already acted to correct what they later called inappropriate behavior. But there was no mention of that in the IRS initial response, nor was there any mention of this behavior, which was by that time well known within the agency, in a second letter sent back to us in September 2012. So they had a second opportunity in 2012 to tell us what they knew. We had to wait several more months to wait for a special investigator's report that Republicans demanded in order to find out the truth of what was actually happening over at the IRS. In the coming days, we'll learn more, and we'll start getting answers to questions like, was the IRS deliberately misleading Republican senators? Or was it betraying profound incompetence? But as I said, the fact is none of this would have come out if we'd relied on the administration's own word and Republicans hadn't demanded to know the truth. Now, clearly, we've only started to scratch the surface of this scandal. The American people are looking for answers, and I'm determined to help them get to the bottom of this. Last June of 2012, I gave a very public speech in which I called out the Obama administration for serial abuses of government power in going after its political enemies in the middle of a heated national election. Now, the left scoffed at the suggestion. The Washington Post said my speech was full of, quote, red herrings, end quote. The New York Times called my argument, quote, bogus, end quote, and Robert Reich called it bonkers. Well, you know what we learned last week, these abuses were even more widespread than first thought. So it's good to see even some of my Democratic colleagues now criticizing the IRS for such blatant and thuggish abuse of power. It's preferable to the silence, or worse, encouragement, that they've demonstrated in the past. The chairman of the Finance Committee was correct in referring to the IRS actions as an outrageous abuse of power and a breach of the public's trust. He's vowed to get to the bottom of what happened, and he's promised that his committee will hold hearings on all of this. Those hearings, my friends, should be tough, and they should aim to bring the light of truth to all of this. But our Democratic friends should also acknowledge their role in inculcating this culture of intimidation due to repeated calls for increased IRS scrutiny of groups like the very ones that ended up being targeted. Now, we owe it to all Americans to get right down to the bottom of this scandal and to hold those responsible accountable and to put the proper safeguards in place for moving forward. Because as the President was correct in noting yesterday, one day a Republican will inhabit the Oval Office. And when he or she does, the left will want to know that they will not be harassed for having the audacity to disagree. That an agency like the IRS will return to its proper role as completely nonpartisan and apolitical. Not a tool for an administration of one stripe to bully and intimidate those who adhere to another. But in order for Congress to effectively perform the oversight it needs to do, the administration will have to make everyone who can answer these questions available expeditiously. We have even more questions today than we did last year, and we're not going to accept more half-baked responses. We want to get the full truth this time, and, Madam President, we intend to get it. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 11 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half.
Madam President.
Senator from California.
Madam President, pretty soon we're going to go back to the Water Resources Development Act, otherwise known as the WRDA bill, and I will comment on that soon. We are making terrific progress. I hope senators who may hear my voice would understand that we would prefer to deal with a number of amendments rather than vote cloture. We have been working with almost, well, I can't tell you, 20 different senators to try and accommodate them to either take their amendments, if they're non-controversial, by voice, or to make sure we can vote on their amendments or side-by-sides. The bottom line is it is time now, it's past time, that senators decide if they want to really move this bill forward in an open way with regular order, or they want to avoid these very important amendments that we could vote on and go straight to cloture. So I hope we can continue to work through the morning. Madam President, there's no room for politics at the IRS. Senator McConnell is right, Senator Reid is right, they've both addressed it. And the issue here is the IRS has to be completely neutral in politics, but they have to go after organizations and individuals who are not abiding by the rules, whether they're right, left, center, or no ideology at all. And, I mean, I remember during the Bush years, we saw the IRS targeting liberal churches. It was awful. And they were harassing them and forcing them to show that they were nonprofits. And now we see the IRS has been targeting Tea Party groups. So whether they're targeting right or left, that is wrong. And anyone doing it, frankly, needs to get another job, because that's just against the law. We can't have politically motivated audits or harassing people, whatever their politics may be. So here's what we do need. We do need a fair IRS that definitely looks at whether organizations, be they left or right, are truly deserving of tax-exempt status. That is important, but not targeting one group or another. So let us just hope and we also know that the targeting of the Tea Party groups took place while a Bush appointee was the head of the IRS. Probably, perhaps was quite unaware. But the bottom line is people at the top have to be held accountable. I agree with that. So he should have known what was going on. But there's no room for this. And I do believe there has to be serious action taken at the personnel level. Otherwise, people will just go ho-hum. No, not ho-hum. You cannot use a position to harass people because of their politics, regardless of where their politics may lie. On another topic I feel I want to be heard on, which is the issue of Benghazi. And I wrote an op-ed piece on this because I absolutely cannot believe what is happening with our Republican friends on this issue. As a senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I can say that I sat through the entire testimony of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Not only did she sit for hours, not only was she straight from the heart and straight from the shoulder, but she took full responsibility with what went wrong. And she ordered an independent investigation, which was launched by Admiral Mullen and Ambassador Pickering. They did an exhaustive study, and what they found out is that, unfortunately, we did not have enough security at that outpost. It was not an embassy, but it was definitely an outpost. Now, there's a lot of talk going on about how could this happen, and emails and all the rest. Let me focus on something very important. It takes funding to protect an embassy. It takes funding to protect a consulate. It takes funding to protect an outpost. Yes, it takes funding. Who cut the funds from embassy security? The Republicans in the House. That's who. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And if it wasn't for the Democrats, it would have been cut more, because when it came here, we stood our ground. We had to accommodate their cuts. That's how the process works. So I think the Benghazi scandal, in quotes, starts with the Republicans looking in the mirror. Mirror, mirror, who's the fairest of them all? They ought to ask, mirror, mirror, who cut the funding for diplomatic security across this world for America? The answer, Republicans. They cannot stand the heat, so they turn it on Secretary Clinton, and that is completely wrong. So I say, you want to know what happened in Benghazi? It starts with the fact that there wasn't enough security, and there wasn't enough security because the budget was cut. And Secretary Clinton said she, in hindsight, should have definitely fought against it even harder than she did. But let the record show, she said, she predicted problems. When she saw the cuts, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but to paraphrase, she said, there's going to be problems here. This budget is cut too much. And she was right. Now, what about these talking points? Madam President, I don't know if you sit down with your staff when you put out a press release to discuss how you're going to phrase something. I don't know whether you do that. I don't know whether you just do it by yourself. Well, what I do and what most people do, they have a collaborative process. And when you are trying to put out a press release with a whole number of agencies having to sign off on it, it is a collaborative process. At the end of the day, one statement was approved. And the statement that was made by Susan Rice, her paraphrasing of the statement was, it looks like this started because of this protest, but we don't know for sure. We don't know. And as we know, we will say. The day of or the day after what happened in Benghazi, the President of these United States, President Obama, stood up and said, this was a terror attack. So why are the Republicans playing politics with this? It's pretty clear. Their attack coincides with a Karl Rove ad against Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They're going after her. Why? Because they are looking to the 2016 presidential election. And I got to say, Keep politics out of the IRS. Keep politics out of Benghazi. Don't take 4 beautiful Americans who died in a tragic fashion and play politics, 2016 politics with it. It's an outrage. So I say start off by looking in the mirror, stepping up to the plate, admitting that you cut too much from embassy security, and, you want to hold a hearing on it, fine. But call the people to the table who can help us make sure this never happens again. So I will continue to speak out on Benghazi. I will continue to speak out on whatever issues my Republican friends are pounding on, because at the end of the day, the bottom line is who cut the money for embassy security. And if they want to divert attention from that, be my guest, but I will bring it home. Everyone knows if we had adequate security there, it could have well been a different outcome. Madam President, I have 11 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I see that my friend is here to make some comments, so I will sum up my points now. Anyone who hears me, please, if you have an amendment that you are working on with us, please come down to the Senate. Let's get this unanimous consent that we hope to make shortly agreed to. Let's get to the amendments. There's a whole list of bipartisan amendments that we believe have been cleared, and let's get this bill done. The ratings that we've been given from the engineers is a D+ for our infrastructure. That means we need to deepen our ports. It means we need more flood control. It means we need to invest in water infrastructure. We need to restore wetlands. We have a lot of work to do. And as we enter periods of time now where there's more and more extreme weather we've never seen before, we need to make those investments to prevent the worst from happening. We saw what it costs, Superstorm Sandy. One event, $60 billion. How does that make sense? To pay after the fact, we need to invest. This bill has a lot of reforms that are important, and I think our people know they need to fix their infrastructure, whether it's roads, whether it's bridges, or water infrastructure. It has to be done. This bill will support 550,000 jobs, and Lord knows people need that as well. So with that, I would yield the floor, and I note that my colleague is waiting to speak, so I will just yield the floor to him.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate continues work on the water projects bill. They're in a quorum call. Vote today at noon, a cloture vote on ending debate. And that is set for noon Eastern, and they will take their weekly party recess for party lunches at 12:30. During this quorum call, we're going to take you over to the Senate Agriculture Committee. They're meeting today to mark up the Farm Bill. It's underway. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Senator Chambliss for all the work we did together on, well, first of all, one farm bill you and I did together in 2002, and then we did the 2008 with Senator Chambliss, and that was one where we had, remember, up and down the ladder, 2 presidential vetoes and overriding vetoes. That was something else. But anyway, we won. In the final analysis, we did win. So this has been an enjoyable tenure on this committee, and again, I thank you, Madam Chair, for your great leadership of this committee. I always marvel at the fact that our chair has a unique distinction of having served on the Agriculture Committee in the state legislature, the U.S. House, and the U.S. Senate. I don't know that anyone else has ever had that kind of a career. So, again, I thank you, and thank you for all your diligence in getting this bill through under some really tremendous, terrible hardships, the budget things, fights that we had. We had this bill, I thought, put together last December, if I'm not mistaken, and then, well, you know what happens outside of this committee, so we didn't get it. So I just, again, hopefully we can get this over the finish line now. Just a couple of things. Look, I know there's a lot of problems that we have, budget problems that we have to solve overall, generally. But again, I take great solace in the fact that on a bipartisan basis here on this committee, we've worked hard to limit those kind of budget impacts on rural America. You know, rural America, we're small in numbers. We don't have the clout in the House. We still do in the Senate, thank goodness, but not in the House. And so a lot of the cuts seem to always focus on those areas, rural America. And so this committee, I think, has been a bulwark in limiting those kinds of impacts on farmers and on small towns in rural America. I would just note on the nutrition cuts, we should take great pride. I think all of us should take great pride in the fact that in America, we don't. Well, yes, there are pockets of hunger. I don't mean to say that they're not. There are. But basically, we take the lead of any nation in the world in ensuring that people who are having a hard time, who are in poverty, out of work, for whatever circumstances, can access good, nutritious food in this country. That had to be a source of pride for us and a continuing source of pride. So I hope that as we try to work ourselves out of budget problems, we don't just kind of succumb to the fact that, well, people like that don't have much of a voice or much of a vote, and therefore we can take it all out of nutrition. We took, as you know, $4 billion out here. The House is over $20 billion. I hope we can stick with your number, Madam Chair, and that was agreed upon on a bipartisan basis. I also want to just mention briefly the conservation title. Again, I want to commend both you, Senator Cochran, Senator Roberts, for strong improvements in this program, including the Conservation Stewardship Program. I regret, however, that the conservation funding is cut from the budget baseline levels, but again, I thank all of you for limiting those conservation budget cuts. Lastly, let me just say the bill contains a strong crop insurance program. That's wonderful. And in fact, it makes it even more beneficial to farmers. That's certainly of substantial economic value to my Iowa farmers, I'm sure farmers all over America. I especially want to express my strong congratulations for the momentous agreement that was reached between the farm community and the conservation community to reinstate minimum conservation requirements in order for a farmer to receive federal crop insurance subsidies. I think this is a very, very important policy reform. Lastly, on energy programs, again, I commend our Senator Stabenow and Senator Cochran for including a substantial level of mandatory funding to continue these effective and beneficial initiatives. So again, Madam Chair, thank you, and thanks Senator Cochran and so many others that worked to bring together, I think, a truly, truly very good bill.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'd now like to turn to Senator Johanns. And in addition to having 4 former chairmen of the committee, we have a former secretary of the Department of Agriculture. I don't know any committee that has such a wealth of expertise and depth of knowledge as this one. And Senator Johanns, we very much appreciated your leadership and experience with the committee.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I might just note that during the time I was Secretary of Agriculture, I had the pleasure of working with 2 different chairs because the Senate flipped. And I started out working with Saxby Chambliss, and that was an honor and a pleasure. And then I had an opportunity to work with Senator Harkin, honor and a pleasure. And the thing I would say that most impressed me, there was no difference whatsoever in the level of partisanship. Whether I was working with Tom Harkin or Saxby Chambliss, we worked on policy issues. We had our agreements and disagreements on policy issues. There was never an issue about partisanship, and I sure appreciate that back in the days when I was the Secretary. Let me also start today and just say thank you to the Chair and to the Ranking Member. I want to tell you I appreciate all the work you've done. I also thank the staff. I'm guessing all of our staff are working on few hours of sleep, and it's because of their hard work that we can be here today and start marking up a farm bill. I certainly know that creating a farm bill is never easy. There's a lot of different philosophies about farm policy, and of course we come from different parts of the country, different crops. But as many of you know, I have concerns with this farm bill. First, let me start kind of at the macro level and talk a little bit about the savings in the bill. The bill, in its purported $24 billion worth of savings, actually double counts $6.4 billion in savings from spending that's not actually in the bill. It was already signed into law in 2011 in the bill that resulted in the sequester. Second, it contains what I would describe as a gimmick. It hides $3.1 billion in payments right outside the 10-year budget window. It reminds me of the days back when I was governor of Nebraska. Times were tough, and somebody was suggesting, well, we can balance the budget by just delaying the school aid payment until the next fiscal year. That didn't solve any problems, and this doesn't solve any problems. That's just no way to deal with budget issues. I also fundamentally disagree with target prices. Congress should get out of the business of setting prices. That's why we have markets. Farmers don't always get the price they want, and farmers recognize that that's a part of agriculture. If we keep telling farmers to plant for prices that are higher than the market or cover the cost of production even, they will simply respond to that, and the end result is you have planting that is too much and lower prices. That drives prices down, continuing the cycle of low prices and government payments. It's just not the right policy for agriculture. But I don't recall ever being at a meeting in Nebraska where a farmer has said to me, Mike, we don't need direct payments anymore, but we could really use higher target prices. I don't even remember them saying to me, we need a shallow loss program. Farmers just basically said the basic crop insurance program that we have is working. Try to do everything you can to sustain that program. Having said those things, there are some things in the bill that we can't ignore that I would rate on the positive side. It does have the tightest AGI and payment limits of any farm bill that I'm aware of. It also makes sure that farmers are actively engaged in the farming operation. Furthermore, this farm bill preserves and I would say does a good job with the basic crop insurance program. I appreciate that those reforms are not always popular in some regions of the country. I certainly know that, having proposed some reforms in those payment limit areas when I was Secretary. So I applaud you for including those. That's tough sledding. I'm especially pleased with the efforts to streamline and simplify the conservation programs. That's an issue I've heard a lot about. I suspect we all have. In fact, I proposed some similar changes as Ag Secretary during the last Farm Bill process, and I'm just pleased you followed up on that, Madam Chair. The improvements reduce costs as well as make the programs more farmer-friendly. This bill also provides for basic research at USDA, universities, private foundations, and companies that is needed to meet demands for our farmers to produce more food on less land. It helps us address the challenges of the future. My hope is that we can do more in that area. And it does so in a way that includes new avenues to ensure that important work continues in times of tight federal budgets. Finally, I'm pleased that this bill builds on efforts to support beginning farmers and ranchers, veterans, and others looking for a career in agriculture. My hope is that during the markup today we can improve upon this bill, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, and I thank the ranking member also.
Thank you very much, Senator Heitkamp. Welcome again to the committee. We're so glad to have another strong agriculture voice from North Dakota, and appreciate your leadership.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Stabenow and Ranking Member Cochran. There's probably not a lot of members of my freshman class who would sit at a table like this and say, this is the primary reason why I wanted to be in the United States Senate, to represent North Dakota agriculture, to represent our producers, and really represent an economy in North Dakota where 90% of what we do is agriculture. We are a huge part of that 16 billion people strong effort, and we are very, very proud of what we do because we do a lot of diverse things. Where somebody might be deeply concerned about commodities, we are also concerned about specialty crops and beekeepers and custom combiners. We are really, we think, the breadbasket and the great food producer for our state and for our country. And just wanted to make the point where you've heard a lot about energy. Yes, we produce a lot of fossil fuels, but we also are very concerned about the energy title, very concerned about continuing the efforts for all of the above, which has got to continue to include biofuels. I'm going to submit these remarks for the record, but I wanted to tell you how grateful I am for your leadership and the leadership of the ranking member to bring a bill, albeit not perfect. There are things in this bill, just as you've heard the gentleman on the minority talk about, that I wouldn't necessarily agree with. But I promised the people of my state that I would come with the attitude towards compromise. What's doable? And I would close with one final thought. The Farm Bill has never been a partisan bill. It might be a regional bill, but it's never been a partisan bill. And we will be judged, it seems to me, in our states and judged in this country if we can, in fact, get public policy out to an area that provides 16 million jobs in a timely fashion. And so hopefully we'll be able to do this. We'll be able to achieve the compromises that we need to move this forward. But we're extremely hopeful that the House will also do this. And just for once, if we could set a goal of getting this done before the expiration of the extension, that would be an amazing feat and one I think we could talk about for a lot of years coming forward as an example of what we could do. Thank you, Chairwoman, and I look forward to the markup.
Thank you very much. And now turning to Senator Thune, we thank you for your leadership in so many areas, certainly as a strong advocate for reform and conservation, and appreciate all of your involvement in this bill.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I want to thank you and the Ranking Member Cochran and all of your staffs that have worked so hard to get us where we are. This is kind of deja vu all over again. We went through this process a year ago and produced a bill that we had hoped would make it into law. It didn't, so we are back. And I hope that as this bill moves forward, we can shape it in a way that does move us into a future for agriculture that is more based upon the market and less on planting for the government. I think this bill, I had hoped this was going to be back to the future. I think it's back to the past in some respects in terms of the architecture that is used in past farm bills. It encourages farmers to plant more for the government than for the market. But I do believe that, you know, this is a starting point, and in the current climate of budgetary and fiscal constraint, it's important that we subject all areas of federal spending to close examination, and the Farm Bill, of course, is no exception to that. We've got to do our part to try and figure out how to find savings so that we can begin to reduce our deficit and our debt. And, of course, we can't exempt any program from reform. Over the past 2 years in preparation for this particular Farm Bill, I've introduced various pieces of legislation that would reform several components of the Farm Bill and save more than $50 billion. I think this committee can write a Farm Bill that provides an adequate and equitable safety net for production agriculture, delivers assistance under the nutrition title to those who need and deserve it, and also makes available the tools needed to conserve and protect our forests, soil, and natural resources, yet still saves taxpayer dollars. We all must face the reality that the commodity title programs, as we currently know them, need reform. Commodity programs should provide a safety net and not an unnecessary enticement that distorts planting intentions. I commend the members of the various commodity, crop insurance, and conservation and wildlife organizations who responsibly came together in the past few weeks.
Alarming reports that have recently surfaced about the IRS and the Department of Justice. As the federal agency tasked with administering the U.S. tax code, the IRS has an extraordinary influence on the lives of all Americans from all walks of life and all points of view. As citizens, we have the absolute right to expect the IRS to be free from political influence, with taxpayers treated fairly and enforcement carried out in an unbiased manner. Unfortunately, in recent days, we have learned that our expectations are far adrift from reality. Last week, the Internal Revenue Service acknowledged a history of targeting conservative, politically active groups during their process of seeking tax-exempt status. This practice first involved flagging groups concerned about government spending and debt. Ironically, such targeting comes at a time when poll after poll indicates that the federal government's out-of-control spending and our $17 trillion debt are top concerns for all Americans. And I can tell you from my experience, it's the top concern for Nebraskans. Despite these legitimate concerns and the patriotic desire of Americans to effect change in government, the IRS worked to impede these organizations with one of the bluntest instruments of government, regulatory abuse. The IRS demanded inordinate amounts of documents from these groups, including donor lists, which served to unfairly delay the tax-exempt certification of these well-intentioned groups. This news is alarming on multiple fronts. First and foremost, it is unacceptable that the IRS would blatantly target any of our fellow citizens, let alone groups of Americans whose views are at odds from their own. As the Washington Post noted in today's lead editorial, any unequal application of the law based on ideological viewpoint is unpardonable, toxic to the legitimacy of the government's vast law enforcement authority. I couldn't agree more. These activist groups were simply trying to exercise their First Amendment rights of peaceable assembly and free speech, the cornerstone of our democracy. Yet their reward for expressing concern about the direction our country is going was to be singled out in an attempt to prevent them from fully engaging in the democratic process. It has been reported that the targeting of these Americans and muffling of their voices on the pressing issues facing our country began in 2010. Well, what's happened since then? The passage of very consequential pieces of legislation, including Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, the Financial Reform Act, multiple debates on how to address our nation's dire fiscal situation, 2 national elections, including last fall's presidential election. As alarming as the actions of the IRS are, I'm even more troubled by the IRS trying to hide these actions. When an IRS official finally acknowledged and apologized for the targeting of conservative groups last week, it was more than 3 years after the practice is said to have begun. It was more than a year after the current acting IRS Commissioner, Stephen Miller, is reported to have become aware of the targeting. But it doesn't stop with Mr. Miller. As the Washington Post noted, Lois Lerner, the head of the IRS's tax-exempt organization office, knew about the targeting in 2011. She seemed to say Friday that she learned about it from news reports last year. These were not the malicious actions of a rogue agent or simply another example of government incompetence. Instead, this was a clear, methodical abuse of government power to discriminate against whole groups of Americans simply because of their political beliefs. Despite their awareness of abuse, officials from the IRS failed time after time to disclose this targeting, and little effort was made to end the practice. Even as recently as their admissions on Friday, the IRS continued to engage in cover-ups and half-truths. In fact, IRS officials seem to go out of their way to deny wrongdoing. In testimony last year before the House of Representatives, then IRS Commissioner Douglas Shulman said there was absolutely no targeting. After years of neglecting to inform Congress of this practice, the long overdue admission was the result of diligent lawmakers exercising oversight, along with a soon-to-be released report from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. The time for muted outrage and limp apologies has passed. The American people deserve nothing less than absolute assurance that this practice will not happen again. Those who are responsible must be held accountable and removed from their positions. The policies that enabled this gross abuse of power must be changed immediately. It is also worth noting that the IRS is one of the lead federal agencies in charge of implementing Obamacare. It does not appear that the IRS is in any condition to implement this highly controversial law, particularly as public trust in this agency continues to plummet. Now, Madam President, just yesterday we learned of another breach of public trust and another potential violation of our First Amendment freedom, the freedom of the press. Press reports indicate that the Department of Justice secretly obtained extensive telephone records of reporters and editors for the Associated Press in what the head of the news organization called a massive and unprecedented intrusion into how news organizations gather the news. According to the Associated Press's legal counsel, the records obtained included those from reporters working out of the House of Representatives press gallery. While it is unclear at this point how many reporters were targeted and why, the effect of this data gathering is clear: intimidation of the press and suppression of free speech. This is unacceptable. A free and unfettered press is vital to any democracy. Moreover, the scope of this information gathering is simply beyond the pale and likely beyond precedent. The Attorney General and the President owe the American people answers, and they owe them now. Mr. President, these recent abuses of power by both the IRS and the Department of Justice are just the latest episodes of this executive branch's disturbing pattern of overstepping its lawful powers. We've seen this in the President's unconstitutional recess appointments. We've seen this in the EPA's disclosure of classified information of cattlemen to activist environmental groups. We've seen this in a lack of forthrightness with our government's response to the attacks on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. The result of this methodical government overreach is a powerful chilling effect on citizens. There is no place for that in a democracy. There is no place for that in the United States. The American people deserve a government that jealously guards the liberties of its citizens, not a government that tramples on our basic constitutional rights. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.